Tove, it's 10 o'clock. We'll wait just another minute or two as a couple more people join, and then we'll get started.
It's against Jewish law to start on time. Jews are not familiar with the concept.
For sure. Tove, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and as more people join, they'll catch up. So, Bruchim Abayim, welcome to Bethel Synagogue in Minnesota, and Shavua Tov, Shana Tova Ki'ilu, Happy New Year, and it's good to be together. Uh, Yesterday, we completed Sefer Breshit, the book of Genesis, and now we're turning to Shmot, to the story of slavery with which we're all familiar. And soon, another week, we'll be reading about the 10 plagues. But even before we re encounter the plagues of Egypt, I think we all have a better appreciation of plagues as we face COVID-19. And actually, in the last sentence of his recent tshuva, Rabbi Golinkin writes, "May God help the doctors finish developing and testing vaccines against COVID-19 corona as soon as possible in order to save humanity from this terrible plague." Indeed, it is. And we thank God that his and our prayers have been answered. We're grateful for the doctors and scientists, the wisdom with which they've been endowed by God to treat and to fight this terrible plague. But along with the tremendous advances in treatment come a whole host of halachic questions. And we're grateful to have two of our movement's greatest poskim, Jewish legal scholars, help us understand not just the requirements of Jewish law, but the ethics behind it. This morning, or in Israel this afternoon, we're joined by Rabbi David Golinkin. Tuesday night, we'll study with Rabbi Elliot Dorff from Los Angeles. And then on January 14th, we'll have our own member, Dr. Avi Nahum, who, using actually his camera, has captured the impact of the disease on healthcare workers. His photographs and stories from the ER are so moving, you won't want to miss it. This series is made possible by a gift to support Jewish learning from Bert and Diane Weisberg. We remember Bert fondly, his passion for Jewish education, and we thank Diane and her family for this opportunity. I had the great privilege of studying with Rabbi Golinkin when I was a student in Jerusalem. It was already many, many years ago. And he came to Bethel to be our scholar in residence probably a decade ago already. But even from a distance, I continue to learn from him and am grateful to welcome him back. Rabbi Golinkin is president emeritus of the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. In his years at Schechter, the Schechter academic programs have grown from 35 students to over 700 students, and the Tali school system has grown from 3,000 children to 65,000 children. And a program in Ukraine called Midreshet Yerushalayim grew from just one school to a whole network of camps and schools and synagogues. For 20 years, he served as the chair of Israel's Vada Halacha, the law committee in Israel, which gives halachic guidance to the Masorti movement. He's the founder and director of the Institute for Applied Halacha at Schechter and also directs the Center for Women in Jewish Law. He's the author of some 58 books, 38 of which are focused on Jewish law, and his most recent tshuva is, as I said, on vaccines in Jewish law. Obviously, so important and timely in our day, and we're delighted, Rabbi, to welcome you back.
Thank you, Rabbi Davis, and thank you, Liz, for the technical assistance. I remember fondly my visit to Bethel, and we have a connection to Bethel, which I mentioned when I was there. We have an annual lecture here at Schechter in memory of Rabbi David Aronson. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Rabbi Aronson. Unfortunately, I did not know him. I knew his widow, Bertha Aronson, who died, I believe, at the age of 106. And she endowed the lecture in 1990 at the Schechter Institute. And every year we have a lecture in his memory. The lecture this year will probably be delivered by Zoom. It's always done in Hebrew. It's for an Israeli audience. But so we have a connection with Bethel in that way as well. There's a Yiddish expression, "Far mein Rede will ich sagen a paar Wörter." Before my speech, I'd like to say a few words. So as an introduction, I'd like to do three things. So I'm just going to share screen with you for a second. Can you see the screen? Okay. So as Rabbi Davis mentioned, not only am I the president emeritus of the Schechter Institute, but I'm also the president of the Schechter Institutes Incorporated, which means my task is to oversee and raise the money for the programs we run for 85,000 people every year. So here in one piece of paper, you see all the major programs that we run at Schechter, our graduate school, which has 400 Israeli educators and communal leaders studying for an MA in Jewish Studies. It takes them a number of years, one day a week, as they continue to work out in the field throughout the state of Israel. The Schechter Rabbinical Seminary, which, as you can see, is much more than just a rabbinical ordination program. For example, there's a Torah Lishma program of people who study Torah a few hours every week for its own sake, and a very large music program called Ashira, which I'm happy to say this chart is out of date. There are now 140 adults who learn how to chant the Nusach, how to chant the services at Schechter every year. The Tawi school system, which Rabbi Davis mentioned, which has 65,000 children within the Israeli public school system who are studying Jewish studies thanks to Tali. And finally, at the bottom of the page in 3 lines, you have our outreach center in Tel Aviv, which in a normal year has 19,000 people attending events. Of course, now they only attend events virtually. And this year, to my surprise, 75,000 people attended virtual events at Neve Schechter in Tel Aviv, much to my surprise. Our branches across Israel, Midrashet Schechter, which is adult ed throughout the country, which has been going strong since March on Zoom. And finally, we run an entire network of schools and synagogues in Ukraine called Midrashet Yerushalayim, where again, most of it has been done online this year, but thank God it continues to flourish. So that in a nutshell is what Schechter does. And if you visit the Schechter Institute website, you can find out a lot more about what we do. As a way of lightening the mood a bit, I want to show you 3 pictures. A number of years ago, I was scholar in residence at Beth Yeshurun in Houston, Texas. They have a beautiful museum in the lobby. And I have the color catalog here. It looks much nicer in color. This is the last picture in their color catalog. For the old timers among you, you may remember that Corona originally had a different meaning. It was a brand of typewriter. What's unusual about this Corona typewriter is that this is a Yiddish typewriter. It's not Hebrew, it's Yiddish. It was used in the 1920s by the father of the person who donated it to Beth Yeshurun. And if you look carefully, you can see that it's a Yiddish keyboard and not a Hebrew keyboard. For example, there's a double Vav. And he used it to take minutes of the shul meetings at his shul in New Jersey. So it's nice to know that then they had recording secretaries as well, but in Yiddish, not in English. So that's Corona. The second thing, I'm teaching a course now at Schechter on the Haggadah. Unfortunately, this picture did not come out very clearly, but we did a whole class on the 4 sons in Jewish art. And one of my students sent me this picture. This is the Rasha, the Chacham, the Tam, and Sheino Yodei Alishol. For those of you who can't see, the Rasha, the evil son, has no mask. The Chacham has the mask worn properly. The simple son, the Tam, has the mask covering his mouth but not his nose. And Sheino Yodei Alishol has the mask on his chin. So that's a relevant rereading of the four sons. And finally, my wife sent me this very cute cartoon, which you're going to revolve around. And this has directly to do with our topic of vaccinations. And this guy is sitting here with a plate full of a huge hamburger and fries, and he's smoking, and he's got mayonnaise on the table. And he says, there's no chance that I'm going to take a vaccine. Go know what poison they're putting into our bodies. So everybody chooses the poison they put in their body. And some of those who are afraid of vaccines don't mind eating hamburgers and French fries on a regular basis. More seriously, what I'm about to do is teach you my tshuva, my responsum about vaccinations. But before I do that, whoops, I don't know why that happened. Before I do that, you need to know what responsa are. And I'm assuming that many of you have never read any responsa. Responsa are simply questions the rabbis answer that Jews ask. And the responsa literature began in the Talmudic period. I found mention of some 40 responsa in the Babylonian Talmud itself, but it really took off in the period of the Geonim. And here you can see the way that the responsa literature fits into all of Jewish law. At the top of the page, you have the Bible, the Tanakh, completed about 175 BCE, followed by the so-called Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law. In the middle column, you have the Mishnah. Under the Mishnah, you have two lines leading to the Talmud Yerushalmi on the left, the so-called Palestinian Talmud, which is really a misnomer, and the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. And then how did Jewish law keep up to date? So first of all, the rabbis in the period of the Geonim decided that the Babylonian Talmud is the main Talmud. That is the main source of Jewish law. You'll see that I will quote the Babylonian Talmud a number of times in this lecture. And how did it keep up to date if the Babylonian Talmud was finished about 1,500 years ago? It kept up to date through the three columns in front of you. On the left, you have commentaries on the Talmud, such as Rashi and Tosfot that you've all have heard of, all the way down to Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago. In the middle column, you have the codes of Jewish law, such as Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, the Tur from Spain in the 14th century, the Shulchan Aruch from Tzfat, from Safed in the 16th century, Rabbi Yosef Karo with the Ashkenazic editions of Rabbi Moshe Isserles. I will mention both of them a number of times today, all the way down to Rabbi Isaac Klein's Guide for Jewish Religious Practice, published in 1979. And on the right, you have the largest branch of Jewish law, which is called the responsa literature. These are many volumes. I have here on my office maybe 200 volumes of responsa. At home, I have probably another 100. That might sound like a lot. It's actually a very small percentage of the responsa literature. I have here on my shelf you can see how fat this book is. I have a 4-volume work called Kuntras HaTshuvot HaChadash, the bibliography of the responsa literature. In other words, these 4 volumes are not a list of responsa. These 4 volumes are a list of volumes which contain responsa. The bibliography lists over 4,400. This was published by the Schechter Institute. The bibliography lists over 4,400 sets of responsa, including one of the ones behind my head here by Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, which is 23 volumes of responsa. So all in all, you're talking about over 500,000 individual responsa published by rabbis during the past 1,500 years. And those are only the ones that have reached us. I'm sure that there are many that were lost along the way that have not reached us. So the responsum that I'm going to teach you today fits into this long line of responsa written by rabbis for the past 1,500 years. And I wrote here some of the more famous respondents on the page: the Maharam of Rothenburg, the Rashba in Spain, the Rosh also in Spain, and in our day, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg. I will mention two of them later on. And including the responsa of the conservative movement by the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, of which Rabbi Dorf is the chair, the responsa of the Vad Halacha in Israel, of the conservative movement responsa group here in Israel, which I was the chair of for 20 years. And in addition, I have written many, many responsa over the course of the past 35 years, about 900 responsa. And Rabbi Davis said that the one I'm about to teach you is my most recent responsum. That's the most recent responsum that I published. During the past week, I wrote two other responsa. So people ask me questions all the time, and I answer them in Hebrew or in English. And that is the way that the responsa literature works. The last thing that I'm going to show you, and then I will send it to Rabbi Davis and he can circulate it, is a bibliography of conservative responsa. Whereas these are volumes of responsa written by conservative rabbis, mostly in English, some in Hebrew, beginning in the early 20th century, including the responsa of the various law committees and responsa written by individual conservative rabbis. So I will send that to you, to the rabbi and to Liz, and they can circulate it to you. Some of these responsa are online, many of them are not. So that's what I wanted to share with you as an introduction to our topic. And now I'd like to teach you the responsum that I wrote on the subject of vaccinations. And interestingly enough, I was asked about this a year ago before anybody knew what the coronavirus was. At the time in Israel, there was a big machloket going on. There was a big controversy going on. There were people, especially Haredi Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, who were not having their children vaccinated with the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella. And there was a lot of talk about it at the time. And one of my colleagues here at Schechter, Rabbi Ilana Foss, whose grandfather, I believe, she's related to Rabbi Cass Abelson, and she asked me, is it required to get a vaccine according to Jewish law? And B, if people refuse to get a vaccine, can you tell them that they're not allowed to enter a school or a synagogue or a public place because they're going to infect or endanger other people? And I began to gather information and response on the subject, not realizing how relevant this topic would become in a short amount of time. So when I wrote the responsa in Hebrew and in English in November, I had already gathered quite a bit of information, quite a bit of responsa, and at the end, we'll send you this responsum. It's 25 pages long. The last 3 pages are bibliography on the subject of vaccines in Jewish law. So what I'm going to do, since this is a very long responsum, I'm going to skip around. I'm just going to give you a number of the points that I made, and I hope that you will then read the responsum yourselves to see all of the various sources and ta'anot and points that I make in this responsum. So the first point that I make has to do with the Jewish attitude towards medicine in general. And here I refer primarily to a responsum that I already published in volume 2 of my Responsa in a Moment set of responsa. It's also online at the Schechter Institute. It's called What is the Jewish Attitude Towards Medicine? If you write my name and what is the Jewish attitude towards medicine, you will find it. And there I give a full range of Jewish attitude towards medicine for the past 3,000 years. And believe it or not, some of our sources were very opposed to medicine. But the source or the approach that won out was the approach of the Rambam of Maimonides, both in his commentary on the Mishnah and in his Code of Jewish Law, the Mishneh Torah. And he's commenting there on the Mishnah, which says that if Reuven, and in Jewish law, you always talk about Reuven and Shimon. It's like Sam and Joe, right? If Reuven vowed not to receive benefit from Shimon, Shimon, who is a doctor, may nonetheless heal him with life-saving medicine, right? Even though Reuven took a vow that he can't benefit from Shimon. And the question is how? That's what the Mishnah says. And the Rambam says this is not forbidden to the patient because it is a mitzvah, i.e., that the physician is obligated by law to heal the sick of Israel. And this is included in the sage's commentary on the verse, and you shall restore it to him, Deuteronomy 22. Deuteronomy 22 talks about hashavat avedah, returning a lost object. We all know what that means. You find a wallet in the street, you try and return it to the person who lost the wallet. But the sages said that returning something, hashavat avedah, also means returning a person's health or their life to them. So he says the physician has a responsibility, lahashiv avedah, to return the health or the life of the person in question. In other words, Shimon is required to help Reuven. It doesn't matter that Reuven took a vow that Shimon can't help him. Shimon, as a doctor, has an obligation to help Reuven. As the Rambam puts it, that if he saw that he is lost and could save him, then he must save him with his body or his money or his knowledge. And the same thing applies to medical issues. So says the Rambam. And that was the opinion that won out, that performing medicine is a mitzvah. And after the Rambam said it in the 12th century, that was accepted by most codes of Jewish law. In addition, before we get to the sources directly related to vaccination, I bring here 10 sets of sources which say that in Judaism, we are required to protect our body and maintain our health. In other words, it's not an optional activity, it's a required activity. And I'm not going to bring all of these ideas. They're laid out in the responsum. I'll mention a few of them. We all know the concept of pikuach nefesh, saving a life. I'm not going to talk about that. We all may know the Mishnah from Sanhedrin, that whoever saves one individual is considered as if he had saved the entire world, a very famous Jewish saying. I'm not going to talk about that at length. I want to mention a few other concepts that you might not be familiar with. For example, the Rambam says in Hilchot Deot, which is the laws of beliefs and opinions, and that's one of the unusual things about his code of Jewish law. Usually codes of Jewish law talk about what you do in the synagogue, kosher food, marriage, divorce, civil law. They don't usually talk about your beliefs and opinions. But the Rambam starts his code of the Mishnah Torah with Hilchot Deot, the laws of beliefs and opinions. And in chapter 4 there, he has a section on maintaining health. And this is what he writes. Since keeping the body healthy and whole is the way of God, for it is impossible to understand or know anything about the Creator if one is sick, therefore one must distance himself from things that destroy the body and accustom himself to things which heal the body. And these are, and then he lists them. Remember, the Rambam was a doctor, right? So he says we have an obligation to distance ourselves from anything which destroys the body, such as the things in the picture that I showed you, right? Eating hamburgers 3 times a day with French fries is something that not only the Rambam would frown upon as a doctor, he would tell you it's asur, it's forbidden, right? You may not do anything that will endanger your health, and you have to accustom your body to things which heal the body. And then he lists specific things. So some rabbis said, okay, the Rambam is forbidding those specific activities. But Rabbi Yosef Karo, and especially Rabbi Moshe Isserles in the Shulchan Aruch that I mentioned a few minutes ago, they say that this includes all things that lead to danger, v'kol hayotzebo, and everything similar. In other words, they say that the Rambam was merely giving examples of unhealthy activities or foods, but it comes to include anything which can harm your body. You must stay far away from it. And the fifth concept that I bring in this section of the responsa is the principle of Deuteronomy chapter 4, v'nishmartem me'od lenafshotechem, but guard yourself and guard your soul very much. the translation of that verse is, and you shall guard your souls very much. Now, in the original context, that verse in Deuteronomy chapter 4 has nothing to do with physical health. It's talking about idol worship. But in the eyes of the rabbis in the tractate of Brachot, v'nishmartem ma'od lenafshotechem means physically you need to guard your souls very much. In other words, you have to watch out for your health. And this is a commandment based on a verse in the Torah. Again, the Rambam and the codes of Jewish law codify this. For example, the Rambam says in the Laws of Murder, chapter 11, and so too every stumbling block which is liable to kill, it's a positive commandment to remove it and to guard against it and be very, very careful, as it is written, but guard yourself and guard your soul. He's quoting one of those two verses from Deuteronomy chapter 4. Another concept that appears frequently in Jewish law and Jewish literature about guarding your health is the concept of sakanat nefashot. Sakanat nefashot is endangering your life. You should avoid anything which is sakanat nefashot, which endangers your life. And the Rambam says once again in the Laws of Murder, chapter 11, the sages forbade many things because they entail danger to life. And whoever transgresses them and says, I'm endangering myself, or I don't care, is given lashes. In other words, the court of Jewish law, when there was a court of Jewish law that gave lashes, malkot, they could punish a person for lashes for endangering his life. Whereas he says, it's my life, I can do whatever I want with it. And the Rambam says, no, that's not right. It's not your life. Your life was given to you by God. It's not your option to decide to kill yourself. So if a Jew does something that endangers his life, the court of Jewish law can give him makot, can give him lashes for disobeying this law from the Torah. And again, the Rambam gives specific dangerous activities, such as drinking at night from rivers or lakes, because you might swallow a snake or a leech. You're not allowed to put a coin into your mouth because it might be full of germs and diseases. And again, one might say, well, the Rambam was only talking about those specific behaviors, but other than that, you can do whatever you want. The other codes of Jewish law say no. Rabbi Yosef Karo says, whoever transgresses these things, v'chayotze bo, and similar things, he will receive a good blessing. And again, the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles says in the Shulchan Aruch, and all things are because of danger. It's forbidden to rely on a miracle and to endanger one's soul in all similar situations. So sakanat nefashot, endangering the soul, is not only the specific examples that the Rambam gives, the Shulchan Aruch expands it to any similar situations. And the last general principle that I will tell you before we talk about vaccinations is a Hebrew expression which your rabbi knows, ein somchim ala nes. One does not rely on miracles. If during the past 8 months, somebody was foolish enough to have a wedding and invite 250 people, and you went to that wedding without a mask, you were relying on a miracle, right? You're saying that even though COVID's an incredibly contagious disease, and even though the main way it is spread is from one person to another in close contact, I'm going to go to that wedding and not wear a mask. Okay? In Hebrew, that's called lismoch al hanes, to rely on miracles. The Talmud tells us time after time, do not rely on miracles. For example, in the tractate of Megillah, lo b'chol yom mitrachesh nisa, a miracle does not happen every day. In the tractate of Kiddushin, one does not rely on miracles. And furthermore, again, Rabbi Moshe Isserles in Yoredea in the Shulchan Aruch, a person who guards his soul should distance himself from dangerous things, and it is forbidden to rely on a miracle. So these are general concepts. I listed, as I said, 10 of them in the responsum, which show us the importance of guarding your health and preventing injury, death, disease in Jewish law. Are there any questions or comments about these general principles before we talk about the vaccinations?
Yeah, I have one question for you, Rabbi. I'm a little bothered by the dictum that you cannot do anything which knowingly endangers your life. And my question is, I wonder if the IDF knows that. I mean,
Okay.
go
That does
ahead.
not mean that there are not circumstances when you're allowed to endanger your life. For
Okay,
example, it's a mitzvah to serve in the IDF because
okay,
you are serving in the IDF, which, by the way, I did for many years. If you serve in the IDF, you are protecting the lives of others, and that of course is pikuach nefesh. Uh, Going back to the example I gave of returning a lost object, and the Rambam, if you recall, had a very wide approach, which means if you restore someone's health, you're restoring a lost object. But the example given in the Talmud in the Tractate of Sanhedrin is, let's say it's hard to give this example in Israel because there are no rivers, but let's say you're walking along a river in Minneapolis. Are there any bodies of water in Minneapolis? Yes. What's the biggest body of water? Lake Michigan?
The Mississippi runs through Minneapolis.
Mississippi.
Okay, the Mississippi. Great. You're walking along the Mississippi and you see someone drowning in the Mississippi. Okay? The Talmud says in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, provided, of course, you know how to swim, you're supposed to jump in and save that person. V'hashevoto lo, to restore his body to himself in order to save his life. Okay, so you are allowed to endanger yourself for the express purpose of saving another person's life. But for example, eating hamburgers is not in that category, and going to a wedding with 300 people during COVID is not in that category. There is no reason to endanger your life for absolutely no reason. That was the intent of all of these sources that I mentioned. Another example that I could give you is, it's a very popular thing among certain people in the world to go to Mount Everest, in the area of Mount Everest, and climb Mount Everest, and every year some 20 to 40 people die. I can tell you quite simply that it's absolutely forbidden by Jewish law to climb Mount Everest. There is no reason in the world to endanger your life so you can put a flag on the top of a mountain, right? If you're going there in order to rescue some idiot who went there, that's a different story. But in general, to climb a very high and dangerous mountain simply to say, as Sir Edmund Hillary said, because it was there, that is forbidden by Jewish law because you're endangering your life for no reason. Okay, any other questions or comments about the general principles?
I just had a question about, like, I've been reading in the newspaper about these certain ultra Orthodox sects in New York that are still having weddings and funerals, and they're really having a hard time with what we're talking about. Like, what is their interpretation? I'm just kind of curious to
Okay,
know what their
hold
interpretation is
hold
about
hold
this.
that question. We're going to get to it at the end of the
Oh,
response.
great,
Okay.
thanks.
I deal there expressly with what some of the ultra Orthodox rabbis say. Not all of them. A lot of them are very much in favor of vaccines. Okay, so now I'm going to put up on screen the continuation of my response, which deals with vaccines. Can you all see it? Okay, this is Roman numeral 4, the medical facts proven medicine. There's an important principle in Jewish law regarding medicine, and it's called refuah b'duka. Refuah b'duka means a proven medicine. And this is not an expression that appears in the Talmud. It's an expression that appears in later Jewish law. Of course, in Judaism, late and earlier relative, since our people's been around for such a long time. A later Jewish law in this case means Rabbi Yaakov Emden in the 18th century. By the way, he died in 1776, so it's easy to remember the year that he died. And in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, he has a whole exposition of the term refuah b'duka, proven medicine. And the question is whether vaccines in general, and the COVID vaccine in particular, are considered refuah b'duka, proven medicine. And here I did quite a bit of reading, especially on the website of the FDA. Many people feel that the new COVID-19 vaccines developed by Pfizer and Moderna And so far, those are the main ones, certainly the only ones being used in Israel, which were approved for emergency use authorization, EUA, December 11th and 18th, are not approved in medicine. And you can check on the internet the statistics for yourselves. According to recent polls, 61% of Americans are likely to take the COVID-19 vaccine, while in Israel, 63% plan to get vaccinated. Okay, I'm sure if you check the polls every day, you'll get a different number. But the day that I wrote this, those are the numbers that I found on the internet. And I write that other than crazy rumors that the Pfizer vaccine causes infertility or that it affects a person's DNA, which is nonsense, many seem to be afraid of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines because they use a new technology which is called mRNA instead of the traditional methods. And there's the traditional vaccine, which we'll meet in a moment in the responsa literature. The traditional vaccine is that you use the illness itself in order to develop a vaccine against that illness. That is not what mRNA vaccines do, which is a totally new concept. mRNA make the body react to the COVID vaccine by itself, but without introducing any poison, so to speak, from the virus itself. And I list at the end of the responsum, I list the medical articles that I read, and I say that one can learn from these medical articles that mRNA vaccines are actually much safer than traditional vaccines, since one cannot catch COVID-19 from such a vaccine, since it's not constructed from an active pathogen. In addition, the mRNA vaccines can be produced faster, more cheaply, and in a more standardized fashion. That's one of the reasons it's been so easy for these manufacturers to produce so many vaccines in a short amount of time. As you may have heard, Israel has already ordered some 20 million vaccines from various sources, because most of the vaccines you have to take twice. There are 9 million people in Israel. And furthermore, I talk about proven medicine. What is Refuah B'duka? We'll see in a moment that the first responsa about vaccines in Jewish history appear in the late 1700s, right before and right after Dr. Jenner invented the vaccine against smallpox. Obviously, Dr. Jenner's vaccine did not undergo the vigorous testing done today. Such things did not exist at that time. And nonetheless, the poskim, the rabbis at the time, considered this Refuah B'duka, a proven vaccine, because they saw that it worked on X number of people, and that was good enough for them. Furthermore, the flu vaccine, which we all take for granted, according to the articles that I found on the internet, are only 40 to 60% effective versus the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which are 94 to 95% effective on adults and children aged 16 and above. So for example, the Pfizer in the phase 3 used 43,000 people, participants, different racial and ethnic groups. Half received the vaccine, half received the placebo, with a 95% success rate after 2 doses. This is why the vaccine received the emergency use authorization of the FDA. And vaccines can receive that authorization if they are only 50% effective. And these two vaccines are 94 to 95% effective. And then I go on to list other vaccines, which have nothing to do with COVID, we'll see in a moment that they too are a subject of controversy, to show you the medical facts about these other diseases and other vaccines. And I didn't have to work that hard because 3 rabbis, 1 Reform, 1 Conservative, and 1 Orthodox, had already done extensive research on the medical literature on these other vaccines. Until Dr. Jenner invented the smallpox vaccine in 1796, 400,000 people died every year in Europe from smallpox, approximately. Thanks to the efforts of the WHO, this disease has virtually disappeared from the world 40 years ago. Polio, similar situation. Diphtheria, it had a mortality rate of 5 to 10%. Today, there are less than 100 cases per year in the US because of the vaccine. Measles, There used to be 500,000 cases a year in the United States, and 6.6% of the children who contracted measles during an epidemic would die. Today, the disease has almost been eradicated thanks to vaccines. Rubella, a terrible disease where the mother would get the disease and it would affect the fetuses in utero, miscarriages and terrible birth defects. Today, that has almost been eliminated thanks to vaccines. According to a 92 medical report almost 30 years ago, the measles vaccine prevented 3.2 million deaths worldwide per year, and the polio vaccine prevented 450,000 cases worldwide per year. So the benefits of the vaccines seem to me to be refuah beduka, a proven medicine by any halachic standard. So what about opposition to vaccines? And I'm sure you've read a lot about this during the past few months, if not before. And I bring here some of the statistics of what people today think about vaccines. This was before COVID. In France today, 40% believe vaccines are unsafe, 25% in Greece and Ukraine, and you can find similar statistics in many other countries in the world. I believe that this is a false claim. And for example, I give the statistic on the dangers of the whooping cough pertussis vaccine. There is a 1 in 100,000 chance of contracting encephalopathy and a 1 in 300,000 chance of irreversible neurological damage from that particular vaccine. Smallpox. The death rate from smallpox vaccine is 0.7 per 100,000 people, as compared to 10 out of 100,000 people who take aspirin every day in order to prevent heart attacks, or the rate of death from car accidents. The most famous case of opposition to vaccines was the opposition to the MMR, the measles vaccine. In the 1990s, an article appeared in the Lancet journal which said that the measles vaccine causes autism. Have any of you heard of this? Okay, well, it turns out that not only was it nonsense, it was falsified nonsense. The main researcher on that study purposely falsified the information. It caused a great uproar. Many parents, especially in England, stopped vaccinating because the Lancet is published in England. And the rate of measles infections went way up in England. However, 7 years later, 10 out of the 12 physicians who had signed that study retracted their support. It turned out that the lead researcher had falsified his results. He lost his license, and the Lancet finally retracted the article 12 years too late. In addition, they did 20 studies seeking a link between the MMR vaccine and autism, including a study of over 1 million children. There is absolutely no evidence that this vaccine is linked to autism. And this brings us back to a halachic principle of the Chida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai. His Rashi Tevot, his abbreviation is the Chida. And a number of years ago, I was taking a taxi ride in Jerusalem, and my taxi ride driver's name was Moshe Azulai. I said to him, "Are you by any chance related to the Chida?" He said, "Absolutely. He's one of my ancestors." That's the beauty of driving around in a taxi in the state of Israel. Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai was a very famous posek. He died in 1806. And regarding another medical issue, he said, we do not take into consideration a tiny minority. Lo chayshinan lemiuta demiuta is the words he used in Hebrew and Aramaic. In other words, the fact that a very small percentage of people might have been adversely affected by a vaccine or by some other medical treatment is not a reason not to use that medical treatment. And indeed, Rav Avram Nansig, who was the first rabbi who wrote about vaccinations, says we do not take into consideration, this is in 1785, 235 years ago. We do not take into consideration 1 in 1,000 who died from the smallpox inoculation. We do not eliminate such a great benefit for the sake of such a tiny minority. So said Rabbi Nansik. And now I list in chronological order some 20 poskim, some of them very famous, halachic authorities, who support vaccinations. But before I get to that, let me stop share for a second so I can see your faces, or I can see your blank screens. Do you have any questions or comments about the material that we just covered?
Sure.
Yes, Lee.
I'll-
Lee, can you put on your screen, or you're on some sort of device?
No, it doesn't, no, I can't.
Okay.
So here's the question, which the responsum you quoted begs the question. First of all, we are not allowed to deliberately endanger our lives. That's number one. Great. Number two, smallpox, there's a 1 chance in 8 gazillion that you will die from the vaccine. That deliberately endangering your life. Except the exception is we don't take into consideration such small percentages. And now the question is, where's the red line there? Is 1 in 1,000 acceptable? Is 1 in 100 acceptable? What?
That's a good question.
Okay.
You'll see in a moment that some of the classic responsa on this subject say that even if 1 in 1,000 die, we should still use the vaccine. Now, the rate of death from all the vaccines that I mentioned is way, way smaller than 1 in 1,000. You're talking about 1 in 100,000, 1 in 300,000, 1 in a million. In other words, the vaccines in use today nowhere approach 1 in 1,000. Yet these famous rabbis that we're going to meet in a moment, they use the percentage of 1 in 1,000. And their reasoning is very simple, as we'll see in a moment. Well, what's the alternative? If you don't use the smallpox vaccine, 400,000 people a year are going to die in Europe. If you do use the smallpox vaccine, maybe 400 people will die in Europe. So you're weighing the big evil against the little evil. And normally in Judaism, we prefer the little evil over the big evil. And therefore, it's worth taking the very small risk in order to help a huge number of people. That is the reasoning of the rabbis that we will meet in a moment. But that's a very good question. Any other questions or comments? So now we're going to meet some of the rabbis who dealt with with vaccinations, not just smallpox, for the past 235 years. And this is one of the things I like about the responsa literature. Frequently, a person asks a question and he's convinced that this is the first time that anybody asked that question. That is usually not the case. It is very hard to find a question that people ask that has not been asked before. Obviously, if it's the responsum I wrote about space travel, when Ilan Ramon of blessed memory took off, that specific question was not asked before. But most of the questions that I am asked, including the 2 that I wrote during the past week, have been asked before. And if you're familiar with the responsa literature, you can usually find the precedents or the responsa that discuss the specific question you've been asked. This particular subject of vaccinations has been discussed by many poskim for the past 235 years. So now I'm going to share screen again, and we'll skip around, read a couple of them. We don't have time to go through all of them. And most of them, of course, are not discussing the COVID vaccine except for the last 2. So Dr. Edward Jenner invented the smallpox vaccine in 1796. But even before the smallpox vaccine, which was based on a disease called cowpox, which was, of course, from cows, they were already doing vaccinations against smallpox. And the procedure was quite primitive and quite scary. They would take the pus from a person who had smallpox, and they would insert it in the arm of a person who did not, right? So they were actually taking the virus and putting it in a healthy person in order that he would develop an immunity against the smallpox virus. And this is the procedure that Avram ben Shlomo Nancy, he came from Nancy in France, discussed in a booklet that he published in London in Hebrew in 1785. 2 of his own children had died of smallpox. He passionately supported variolation or inoculation, as it was called then. And I explained what it is, which I just explained. He saw in this method of inoculation the fulfillment of the mitzvah, ushmartem ma'od lanafshotechem, and you shall guard your souls very much. And he was aware of the dangers involved in that procedure. Skipping down a few paragraphs later, we get to a rabbi that you all have heard of, especially if you've ever stopped at a traffic light in Israel and been surrounded by people dancing with large white kippot. And these are the Braslaver Hasidim. And the Braslaver Hasidim, you know what I'm talking about? Right? The Braslaver Hasidim, their Rebbe is called the Toiter Rebbe in Yiddish, the dead Rebbe, because since Rabbi Nachman of Braslav died in 1811, they have not had a Rebbe. Their Rebbe is dead. And believe it or not, Reb Nachman of Braslav already recommended, and see when he died in 1811, he said that Jews should definitely vaccinate their infant children against smallpox. And Rabbeinu Zal said that they must set up pakin. Okay, pakin in Yiddish means pox. They must set up pakin for every baby before a quarter of a year, because if not, he's like a shedder of blood. And even if they live far from the city, he must travel there even when the cold is great. Pakin in Yiddish means pox. And the Hebrew phrase to set up pakin is simply a translation from the Yiddish stellen pakin. And stellen pakin means to vaccinate against smallpox. So here we have this very famous Hasidic Rebbe over 200 years ago, telling his Hasidim that they must vaccinate their infant children before they are 3 months old, even if they live far from the city, and even if it's in the winter in Ukraine, which was extremely cold. So we see here another early proponent of, in this case, the smallpox vaccine. Another very famous source is Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz in his commentary on the Mishnah. He died in 1860 in the city of Danzig. He wrote a very famous commentary on the Mishnah called Tiferet Yisrael, which has been republished innumerable times. And in his commentary on the famous Mishnah in Yoma, which asks the question, what happens if a house collapses? And houses collapsing in the land of Israel was not an unusual event in the time of the Mishnah. A house collapses on a person on Shabbat or Yom Kippur. Are you allowed to pull them out from the ruins, which involves desecration of Shabbat or Yom Kippur? And the Mishnah says, absolutely. And Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz says, even if he will only live for a short time, we are concerned for a short time. And even if it's only a short amount of time that he will live, nonetheless, we dig him out of the ruins. And from this, he extrapolates to the subject of smallpox. And from this, it seems to me permissible to make a pox inoculation, even though 1 in 1,000 dies from the inoculation. In any case, if he develops natural smallpox, the danger is nearer. And therefore, he may place himself in distant danger to save himself from imminent danger. In other words, you can take the inoculation, which is a small danger, in order to fight against the bigger danger, which is all of the people who die from smallpox every year. And furthermore, in a passage that I only found after I looked for it very hard, I knew there was another passage in his commentary to the Mishnah. In his commentary on the tractate of Avot, Pirkei Avot, that you all know, chapter 3, it talks there about Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, that precious is a human being who was invented in God's image. And it's talking there about all human beings, not just about Jews. Rabbi Lifshitz there praises Chasidei Umot HaOlam, the pious among the nations of the world, and some of them did the most good to all the people on earth, like the Chassid, Jenner. He calls Dr. Jenner a Chassid, not a Chassid in the meaning of a member of one of the Hasidic sects, a chassid according to the simple meaning of the Hebrew, a pious, a righteous person who invented the Packenimpfung, which is Yiddish and German for smallpox vaccination, through which tens of thousands of people are saved from disease and death and disfigurement. So this famous rabbi, in the middle of the 19th century, he calls Dr. Jenner a chassid for inventing the smallpox vaccination. Another famous rabbi who did not deal directly with vaccinations was Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, a very famous Orthodox rabbi. He died in 1921. He was asked, what do you do if most of the doctors in a city say that a child needs an operation to save his life, and the parents say, over our dead bodies? The parents say, no, we're opposed to the operation. Do you listen to the parents or do you listen to the doctors? Okay, which is a case you have all the time now with vaccinations. The doctors want to give a child a vaccination, and the parents say, no, we're opposed because vaccines cause autism or all sorts of other mishigasim. Rabbi Hoffman says very clearly, you do not listen to the parents. If a child needs an operation, and at least 2/3 of the doctors in the city agree that the surgery is necessary, then surely the opinion of his father and mother does not make a difference. For it says in Yoradea, in the Shulchan Aruch, that a doctor is obligated to heal, right? The Shulchan Aruch says exactly what Maimonides said in the first passage we studied today. And if he prevents himself from healing, then he is shedding blood. And we have not found in the entire Torah that a father and mother have permission to endanger the lives of their children and prevent the doctor from healing them. This is the law of the Torah. In other words, it's not a parent's prerogative to do something that will endanger the life of their child. Their child's life doesn't belong to them. It belongs to God. And if the doctors, who are the biggest experts, say that that child needs an operation, then that child needs an operation. Just as if the doctors say today that we should all get vaccinated against COVID, we should all get vaccinated against COVID, regardless of the mishigas of a specific parent or set of parents. A few more examples of those who say we should get vaccinated. Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Alevi Herzog, the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of the state of Israel, tremendous Talmid Chacham, says that you can even get vaccinated on Shabbat, which normally you would not do medical procedures on Shabbat because vaccinations save lives. Of course, he was not talking about COVID. He was writing in the 1940s. The ultra-Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Shalom Eliashiv, who died at the age of 102 in 2012. In two different places, he discusses our topic, and he says that parents should vaccinate their children. I'm not going to go into his reasoning right now. We don't have time. Another interesting example, one of the leaders of modern Orthodoxy in the United States, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, was a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University. He talks about another halachic concept where vaccines are mandated by the state, such as in the case of immunizations before entering school. One would be obligated to be immunized based on the concept of dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is the law. In other words, if there is a law in a state or in a country that children must be vaccinated, for example, MMR vaccines, we are required by Jewish law to observe the secular law because of dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is the law. A number of well-known conservative poskim have ruled in favor of vaccinations. Rabbi Elliot Dorff, whom you will study with this week. Famous Reform posek, Rabbi Mark Wachowski, who's the head of the Reform Responsa Committee, writing in 1999. Rabbi Joseph Prauser, writing in 2005 in a responsum approved by the CJLS in the States. And finally, I want to bring two rulings from this current crisis. The Orthodox Union and the Rabbinical Council of America gave a ruling a few weeks ago on December 15th that the Torah obligation to preserve our lives and the lives of others requires us to vaccinate for COVID-19 as soon as a vaccine becomes available. And finally, two interesting examples. Two modern Orthodox rabbis, were so amazed by the fact that the researchers have come up with vaccines in a record short amount of time that they decided to recite a blessing before receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. One of them is my friend, Rabbi Professor Daniel Sperber here in Jerusalem. He recited a Yehi Ratzon from the Talmud before receiving the vaccine, and the Shechianu blessing after receiving the vaccine. Rabbi Avi Weiss of Riverdale, New York, recited the Asher Yatzar blessing, which is a blessing we usually recite after going to the bathroom. He decided that the wording of that blessing was also appropriate for receiving the vaccine. I myself followed Rabbi Sperber's advice. Before I had the vaccine last Monday, I recited the Yehi Ratzon from the Talmud, which is a Yehi Ratzon you recite before a medical procedure. The last thing that I want to deal with is the opposition of rabbis to trying to force people to be vaccinated. So we have seen that many rabbis say that vaccinations are a good thing. We should do vaccinations for all those diseases that we mentioned, and presumably for COVID-19 as well. But what do you do if a person or a family or a group of people say, we don't want to get vaccinated, we don't believe in this nonsense, we think that vaccinations cause all sorts of terrible things, we think that it causes autism, we think that they have put a computer chip in the vaccines in order to track our activities. I'm not making this stuff up. You can read it on the internet. What do we do about those people? Because those people are not only affecting themselves, they're affecting the public. And here I was very surprised to find that there are quite a few prominent Orthodox rabbis and one Reform rabbi who say that you cannot force parents or to vaccinate their children. And if they won't vaccinate their children, you should still accept their children into school. And I list here those rabbis: Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, a famous Orthodox posek in Israel; Rabbi Yoshua Neuwirth, the famous Orthodox posek in Israel; Rabbi Schachter, whom I mentioned before, from Yeshiva University; Mordechai Willig from Yeshiva University; Rabbi Bleich from Yeshiva University; and also the Reform posek, Rabbi Walter Jacob, writing in 1992. And here's an example of this type of thinking. This is from a book of Jewish medical ethics, quoting from Rabbi Neuwirth. There is no doubt that the series of vaccines that are commonly given to a baby prevents disease from it and the population. But there are parents who are afraid of the very small risk involved. Rabbi Neuwirth Shlita, may he live long, since then he has passed away, told me that due to this fear, it's not possible to halachically decide for, the Hebrew word is not clear what he intends. Perhaps the Hebrew word was lahachriach, to force parents that they must vaccinate their children, even though it's obligatory to try to influence them greatly in order to convince them. And then Rabbi Bush, who wrote an article on this, summarizes a big controversy in Lakewood, New Jersey, a number of years ago, 10 years ago, where one group of Orthodox rabbis said that everybody needs to get a vaccine, and another group of Orthodox rabbis said that every individual is entitled, according to halacha, to choose whether to vaccinate his children or not, and schools do not have the right to deny a child acceptance to the school on the grounds that the child has not received the vaccine. And they said that this is a das Torah. This is the opinion of the Torah. This is their binding halachic opinion. And interestingly enough, the OU that I mentioned before, the Orthodox Union, 2 years ago, they issued a ruling about standard vaccines such as measles. And they go on and on about how important it is to receive a vaccine. And then they get to the last line. And this is the last sentence. While the health of children is an important consideration, everyone should consult with his or her religious, medical, and legal advisors in determining what actions to take. I was shocked to read this last sentence. And it was the last sentence of their statement from 2 years ago, cancels out everything they had written before that. Before that, they tell you that it's very important to get a vaccine, and it's really important to get a vaccine. And it's so important to get a vaccine. But if you decide you don't want a vaccine because your rabbi told you not to, you don't need a vaccine. Well, with all due respect, not only do I find this approach surprising, I think that this approach is simply incorrect in Jewish law. We have seen above the views of Rabbi Hoffman from the early 20th century and Rabbi Waldenberg, whom I didn't have a chance to quote. A parent has no halachic right to endanger his children. Furthermore, no one has the halachic right to endanger the public in general or the student public in particular, as we shall see below. And then I go on to quote Rabbi Warshawski, the Reform posek, and he talks about the kahal. The kahal is the Jewish community. And in Jewish tradition, I'm going to take this off the screen so I can see your faces. In the Jewish tradition, the kahal, the Jewish community, has the right to enact takanot. Takanot are rabbinic enactments. You may be familiar with a very famous one. You may have heard of the takanot of Rabbeinu Gershom. For example, according to biblical law, a Jewish man can take more than one wife. But in the year 950 of the Common Era, Rabbeinu Gershom made a takana, which supersedes biblical law. He says, from now and henceforth, Jews are not allowed to take more than one wife. This is called a takana, a rabbinic enactment. And as Rabbi Warshawski points out, the kahal, the community of Jews, can make an enactment. They can make an enactment that a child who does not have a vaccine may not enter our Hebrew school, or a child who does not have a vaccine may not enter our day school. This is not some newfangled invention. The takana of kahal is discussed extensively in the Talmud, in the tractate of Baba Batra, and other places. It's perfectly legitimate to make such a takana, whether it's on the communal level or on the national level, and the same thing goes for the state of Israel, as I explained. Another example that I give here, I'm almost through. Another example that I give here is Rabbi Alfred Cohen, an Orthodox posek, and he compares this to the situation with a pregnant woman. Let's see, going back to my cartoon at the beginning. Let's say that you know a pregnant woman who is not your wife. And you see that every day, 3 times a day, she's eating a double hamburger with French fries and all sorts of other chazarai that are clearly going to harm her unborn child. Are you permitted to say something? Should you say something? Should you prevent her from eating all sorts of unhealthy foods? Or let's take an even bigger example. Let's say she's using drugs. Are you allowed to prevent her from using drugs in order not to harm her fetus? And the answer is yes. Most of the rabbis who have written on this subject have said that the family or the community has the right and the obligation to prevent the pregnant woman from harming her fetus. Well, if you're allowed to prevent a person from harming a fetus, kal vachomer, how much the more so in Jewish law, you can prevent a person from harming other people, because a fetus in Jewish law does not have the halachic status of a person. And therefore, if by sending children without vaccines to school, you are going to endanger the other children, it is perfectly legitimate in Jewish law to prevent those parents from sending their children to school and endangering the other children in the school. Or to take our case, it's perfectly legitimate in the state of Israel for the state to decide that whoever does not have a vaccine may not enter a shopping mall, because by entering a shopping mall without a vaccine, he is endangering dozens or hundreds of people that he will come in contact to in that shopping mall. So in Jewish law, it is perfectly permissible to prevent someone from endangering other people. And finally, and this is a concept that I discussed at length in my responsum against smoking. There's an interesting story in the Talmud about a person who's standing in his yard. You have to look at my hands. I don't have a bow and arrow here. He's standing in his yard outside of his home in Minneapolis. He takes a bow and arrow and he he pulls the bow back and he shoots the arrow into the air, and wherever it lands, he does not know. And it kills somebody. And he says, what did I do? It's not my fault. I didn't intend to kill somebody. I was just shooting my arrows. And the Talmud says, no, you may not do that because that's called gere delay in Aramaic. That's not Hebrew. Gere delay means his arrows. If you do something that harms other people, even though you did not have a direct intent of harming other people, it's still your arrow and you still shot it. And that, for example, is why you're not allowed to open up a factory that belches out 100 tons of dangerous smoke per year next to where people live, because your arrows, in this case, your smoke, are harming other human beings. Well, it's the same thing with a contagious disease. If you have COVID disease, or you don't even know you have COVID disease, and you go to a wedding with 300 people and you're not wearing a mask and you didn't get vaccinated, where you are shooting your arrows at all the people at that wedding. The arrows in this case take the form of your breath, but it doesn't make any difference. Those are gere delay. Those are his arrows. And just as you cannot shoot that arrow, and just as you cannot build that factory, you cannot go into a crowded room without a mask or without a vaccination, because you are going to harm your fellow human beings. So therefore, to summarize, and this I will put on the screen since it's the summary. In conclusion, since the discovery of the smallpox vaccine by Dr. Jenner in 1796, it has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that vaccines against infectious diseases save the lives of millions of people every year, while only a very small percentage experience complications or die. Therefore, there is an halachic obligation for Jews to vaccinate themselves and their children, unless their doctors determine that it's dangerous for that specific person to be vaccinated due to a pre-existing condition. Similarly, it's halachically permissible for a school or a synagogue anywhere in the world, or the government of the state of Israel, to enact a takana or regulation that one must receive a vaccination, and to prevent an unvaccinated person from entering a synagogue, a school, or a shopping mall. And in conclusion, I said what Rabbi Davis said at the beginning: may God help the doctors finish developing, testing, and disseminating the vaccines as soon as possible in order to save humanity from this terrible plague. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free. I'm waiting for Lee to ask a question. Any questions?
All right, I'll ask you a question. Since Rabbi Dorf, who you are familiar with, you know him, right?
Sure. Okay. We're friends.
And he's going to talk in a few days about who should get the vaccine, who should be on the list. I want you to make sure that my name is there. In favor, that's all. All right, I'll take it.
No problem.
All right. Thank you.
Right. He's talking about another important subject, which is triage or triage, triage in French, which is who goes first. And that, of course, applies not only to vaccines, but to many other medical issues. For example, if you have an MRI machine or some other expensive medical piece of equipment, and you can only do 100 of those tests per day or per week in the state of Israel, how do you decide who gets the tests? As this is an ongoing halachic issue without any connection to COVID. If you had limited medical resources, how do you decide who takes precedence? And that's a very important topic in Jewish law, which Rabbi Dorf has written about and which he will discuss with you later this week. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a quick question on the idea of takana. So on my concern with granting the community the kahal the authority to issue a takana is that I might not trust or be able to um, to grant that authority to the kahal. I'm
That's an interesting question. What
they could
happens if
do
you don't
just about
trust your,
anything they
what
want.
happens if you don't trust your community? Then you
Well,
should switch communities. um, by community, do you mean the government, or by community you mean a local community?
a school. If my kids
Okay.
belong to a school, or if I were part of a shul that decided that they were going to have services and everything going on, and it was important to me to be part of that kahal, but I I didn't want to put my own self or family in danger. Can I then separate myself from that kahal?
Okay, well, that's a different question. But your
Well,
first question is, can we really grant every kahal the right to make its own regulations? And that's what's so interesting about this principle of takanot takahal. I gave you an example of Rabbeinu Gershom, but that was not really a good example, because that was a takana made by rabbis, which is important, but that's not what I'm talking about. Takanot kahal means that the kahal, the Jewish community, can make a takana. And this is something some of you may not know. In medieval Jewry, which lasted for many hundreds of years, this is the way that Jewish communities functioned. They had a city council, and a city council of 7 usually or more people would decide policy for that community on all sorts of communal issues. And that was binding. And the reason it was binding was because of this passage in Baba Batra Folio 8A, 8B, which says that a community has a right to set its own regulations. And that became a basic principle in Jewish law. And you may not think about this, but I'm sure that Bethel has many such takanot. For example, in many synagogues, well, this is before COVID, in many synagogues in North America, if you do not have a ticket for the high holiday services, you cannot attend services. But that's terrible. What, you're not going to let a Jew pray? But this is something that many synagogues decided that for the economic benefit or welfare of their synagogue, they cannot let people come to high holiday services without buying a ticket. And this is muvan me'elav, it's self-understood by thousands of synagogues without thinking about the fact that this is takana takahal. This is a takana that the kahal decided to do. Similarly, you cannot have a bar mitzvah in a conservative synagogue unless your child attends Hebrew school for X number of years and attends synagogue X number of times before his bar mitzvah. Chabad, by the way, doesn't have any such takana. They let any Joe walk in off the street and have a bar mitzvah. They have no standards whatsoever. But most conservative synagogues made a takana that bar mitzvah is something we should take seriously, and you can't have a bar mitzvah unless you have had the proper preparation for your bar mitzvah. So these are examples of takanat kahal. So if the kahal can decide that you can't daven on Rosh Hashanah without a ticket, and you can't have a bar mitzvah without sending your kid to Hebrew school, then why can't it decide that you can't send your kid to Hebrew school without a vaccination? In other words, it's part of the same concept of a kahal determining what are its standards for its own kahal, right? They're not deciding for another synagogue, for Temple Beth David or Temple Beth Aaron. They're deciding for Temple Beth El. So I think that this idea of a kahal making its own regulations, I think, is a wonderful concept. And in point of fact, Jews have been making such takanot for at least the past 1800 years, since the time of the Mishnah. So I think that it's a very natural thing to do in terms of Jewish law and practice, which I think is very applicable to the subject of vaccinations. Other questions or comments?
Rabbi Golinkin, an excellent discussion, but it relates to the Jewish community and to Jews, but what about extending that to going into a shopping mall, which is generalized, or as a Jewish physician, am I obligated to take care of non-Jewish patients? I mean, I think I know the answers, but I'd like to hear your
Well,
thoughts.
in my response, and I submitted, after I published this on the internet a month ago, the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards asked me to submit it to them. It's for them to discuss whether they want to issue it as a ruling of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. I did some revisions at the request of some of the members of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, and one of the subjects was that I was talking both about diaspora Jewish communities and about the state of Israel. When I was talking about a shopping mall, I was talking about a shopping mall in the state of Israel. In other words, in my opinion, the government of the state of Israel has the halachic status of a kahal. Whereas just as a medieval Jewish community could decide A, B, and C for the members of that community, the government of the state of Israel can decide A, B, and C for all the people living in the state of Israel. Whereas the government of the state of Israel, I'm talking from a halachic point of view, the government of the state of Israel has the status of a kahal. If the Knesset or the government decides that no one can enter a shopping mall without having a vaccination or without wearing a mask, not only is that a secularly valid thing to do, it's also a halachically valid thing to do. In other words, they have the halachic right to make that decision. Now, how that plays out in the United States, I don't know. We mentioned the concept of dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is the law. And knowing the United States, I'm sure that not only does every state have its own rules on the subject, I'm sure that every municipality and every county has its own rules on the subject. I am sure there will not be a uniform practice in this regard. But it could be that in Jefferson County, Mississippi, they will decide A, and in Hudson County, New York, they will decide B. So I don't, it really depends on the local laws and the local regulations, how they want to deal with this particular issue. But from my point of view, it's perfectly legitimate for a county or a city or a state to decide that without vaccinations, you cannot attend the university. I'm talking about COVID now. Without vaccinations, you cannot enter a shopping mall. And I think that's perfectly legitimate for those legal entities to take such decisions.
Okay. First, a quick comment. I want to tell Sarah Nee Newman, I really love what she's done with her hair. I'm under the impression that Dina Malchuta Dina applies only in cases where Jewish law or halakha is not violated. That is, halakha takes precedence in all cases. Am I mistaken? It wouldn't be.
Well, that would depend which rabbi you ask.
What?
But I said that would depend which rabbi you ask.
Okay.
But normally dina de malchuta dina has to do with civil law, public law, not with ritual law.
Yeah. Okay.
In other words, if the government says you have to eat pork, not only you're not allowed to eat pork.
Yeah. Okay.
If the government says you have to serve in the army, then you're required to serve in the army. If the government says you have to pay taxes and observe traffic regulations, then you're required to do that. And so if the government says that you're required to get a vaccination or you can't send your kid to school, Rabbi Herschel Schachter says you have to do that. In other words, these are aspects more of civil law than of ritual law. In ritual areas, dina de malchuta dina does not apply.
So, but in terms of paying taxes, can't you find some halachic loophole to get me out of? Never mind.
All right, so Lee,
The answer is no.
I want to thank Rabbi Golinkin so much for this shiur, this investigation into the history, bringing it up to modern day of the halacha around vaccinations. And we're I think many have been following how what an incredible job Israel has done in vaccinating its population. It's really inspiring, and we're grateful for your encyclopedia kind of tour de force of the history of responsa around this topic. For those who are interested in Jewish law, I'm actually going to be starting a new series beginning on Wednesday, in which we'll choose Rabbi Golinkin's Chuvot and the Law Committee's Chuvot, and explore a whole variety of topics. So please join me on Wednesdays at 3. And I think given the discussion of a takanot, we have to make a takana at Bethel that when we return and have kiddush, we should have no less than 5 different kinds of chocolate desserts available after shul. That would be #1 on my priority list.
No, somebody might have to come along and prevent you from eating those chocolate desserts.
That's true. That's true. So we look forward to seeing everyone on Tuesday night at 7 with Rabbi Dorf, and then the following week with Dr. Avi Nachum. Thank you again so much to Rabbi Golinkin.
My pleasure. And I will send you the responsum that I wrote along with the bibliography of conservative responsa. And I hope you'll send it out to the whole group.
Wonderful. Shavua Tov,
Okay.
everyone have a good week.
And you're all welcome to visit our website and learn a lot more. On our Schechter website, I have 160 responsa on various topics. So you go to the Schechter Institute website, you look for articles. Under articles, you look for Golinkin, and you'll have plenty to read. Thank you very much. Toda rabba.
Toda lecha.
And stay well.
Thank you very much. Very nicely done.
Jeopardy? Yeah, what'd you do about the microwave?